Well, let's follow up on the government's proposals to reform First Nations education. I spoke with two members of Parliament a little earlier today. I'm joined here in studio by NDP MP Charlie Angus, who has been a vocal critic of federal Aboriginal policies. So too has Liberal MP Joyce Murray. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here. We should point out we did ask the government to provide a member of Parliament to join this conversation today, but that invitation was declined. So let's proceed. Charlie Angus, let me begin with you. The Minister told the Commons today in question period that these proposals are simply that, draft proposals, and he welcomes all kinds of input from whoever wants to make it. But certainly the reviews from the First Nations communities already have panned what's on the table here. Let me start by getting a reaction from you about what the Minister's put before people as his idea of education reforms.
Well, I'd like to congratulate the government. I'd like to be able to congratulate the government for putting education reform on the table, because for the first 6 years they wouldn't even use the word in government. They seemed to think it wasn't a responsibility. I used to like to remind the minister that he's probably the largest, he's the biggest education minister in the country with the number of students. The problem with this, though, is that they haven't dealt with the fundamentals and sent a message that they're willing to deal with the fundamentals. The number one fundamental is the funding gap that exists per capita students. This is how all education across Canada is funded. The fact that the capital dollars are missing, about $158 million a year shortfall. We've got, for example, in my region, 2 communities, large numbers of kids, no schools. So to say we're going to do a bureaucratic response without making a commitment to the dollars and without the negotiations and the goodwill that needs to be established, because these are really complex systems across the country right now.
Joyce Murray, the minister is saying, look, these are proposals. The funding will be laid out later, some months down the road in guidelines. What's the problem with that approach?
Well, first, Peter, I want to say that this is a really urgent issue. When you have approximately 1 out of every 2 Aboriginal children actually graduating from high school, that's wrong. So, but what the Conservative government has done here is put forward something that that is more top-down. It's one size fits all. It concentrates more power in the minister's hands, and as Charlie said, it doesn't address the funding gap. So with respect to consultation, they've given literally a few weeks for consultation on this very complex issue, and they're claiming they're committed to have this in place by the beginning of the school year in 2014. I mean, that's less than a year away, so it is, will they listen to any of the input? It seems unlikely, because they're not giving time to actually consider input, make changes, bring it back, and be able to implement it.
You look at these proposals, and you know, do you look at these and wonder if the no mention of the funding would seem to suggest that the government thinks, look, there are structural issues with how First Nations education is delivered, and it's not a money issue. I mean, from the government's point of view, let's deal with the structural issues. Let's see if we can find a formula of structure that is acceptable to people. Then we'll figure out how to fund it. Is that what we're seeing here?
Well, I think we're seeing some window dressing, quite frankly, because funding is the fundamental on how education is delivered. We're not creating some kind of new world plan here. Education has been worked out across the country in each province. The funding mechanisms, the per capita student funding, the class teacher ratios, they all exist. And the House of Commons on February 27, 2012 stood up, every single member, and voted for Shannon's Dream, the principle named after the late Shannon Kustashian, the youth leader from our region. That we had to close the funding gap, and we had to set up the comparable standards for education on reserve as exists in the provinces, because children in a community like Attawapiskat, where there is no school, have to meet the provincial curriculum, but they have none of the provincial standards. And so part of that is saying, if the federal government said, we are going to close the gap, we're going to establish and make sure that every kid in a community has a proper school, then we're going to sit down and talk about how we deliver this over the long term. That, I think, would have been you would have a lot of buy-in, and we'd be moving forward, rather than once again they put up a trial balloon, then they're on the run, and they can't even show up and defend themselves.
Okay, well, let's look at Joyce Murray on that. So a couple of the key things the government's talking about. Proposing sweeping changes to allow the Aboriginal councils to remain responsible for schools on their reserves, or they can contract out work to provincial school boards or private educators instead. They can form First Nations education authorities that could control all the Aboriginal schools in various regions of the country, hire teachers, principals, manage budgets, and develop curriculum that meet the provincial standards Charlie's talking about, while focusing on Aboriginal culture and language. So what's wrong with that?
Well, let's go back to your other question about the structural
Well, these
problem.
are all the structural changes
Exactly,
they're
but
talking
one
about.
of the structural issues, aside from those, is partnership. It's how much ownership will the First Nation have of what's going on. And sometimes, and in British Columbia, actually, we have the First Nations Education Steering Committee that has done a lot of leading-edge work on how to address the structural problems.
In a lot of ways, it's a model for
well, exactly.
the rest of the country.
They are very upset about this act that's been laid forward. It has not come forward within that structure of partnership, of listening, of inclusion, of First Nations leadership that is so fundamental to success. I mean, Peter, I want to say that in British Columbia, the provincial government has actually done a very good job of starting to address the structural problems. But it does take extra funding. There's Aboriginal education agreements in most of our schools in British Columbia where Aboriginal content and ownership of a component of the curriculum is brought in, and there is a partnership moving forward. I haven't seen evidence that this is what this government is offering. They're offering some sticks and punishment and ability for government to take over if things are failing.
Let me go there. I mean, Charlie Angus, you mentioned, in effect, the government's the biggest. Minister Valcourt is the biggest, or the Minister of Education responsible for the largest number of students in the country, all those First Nations students across the country. And these new proposals include the ability of the federal government to send in an administrator if they find that a system is not working properly, a school's not being run properly. And in my conversation with Chief Morley Gugu earlier, that's a big sore point for Native communities. Again, his position being, look, you're handing us all this extra responsibility. You haven't told us how much money it'll cost, but in the end, you hold the big stick that if you think we're not doing it right, you can come in and take over.
Well, the issue here, again, and it's such bad faith and lack of goodwill, and we're talking about children. I mean, this is about ensuring that children have a good opportunity in life, and that's really what I learned from, Shannon Kustashian. Like, these young people, there's so much opportunity there, but what we're seeing happen is that the government will say that we're going to put our own, be able to come in and check the administration. There isn't an organization on the planet that is more useless when it comes to delivery of service than the Department of Indian Affairs. You want to keep them as far away as you can from anything to do with education. They don't know what they're talking about. They never have. You asked Minister Valcourt, as I asked, what's the shortfall? How many schools need to be built? Couldn't answer the question. What's the shortfall in capital spending? Minister Valcourt didn't know. We were there to discuss issues on education. They don't know. This is an issue. They're putting money into a giant bureaucracy already. They have no standards. They have no norms. So let's work with the First Nations. Let's find ways. And these partnerships could be really good. Partnerships with provincial schools, creating regional school boards. These models could all be really positive. But the idea that the government is going to send in their experts when they've blown this system so badly and hold the First Nation to account without the resources, that's a recipe, I think, for more failure, and we can't afford any more years of failing.
Okay, Joyce Marie, let's finish on that. On this ability, this notion that we want you to do more. Here's the model we're proposing, but does the federal government have the right to say, since it's federal government funding, to say, look, if we think it's not working the way we had set it up to work, we will come in and either, I'm not sure the government would say take over, but we'll come in with an administrator and try to help you get back on track.
I just think that's not useful right now when we have such a funding inequity. I mean, and the government is actually still denying that it is unequal. They're comparing apples with oranges, and so really the remote communities, the elementary schools, have in some cases $7 out of the 10 that a student would have if they were not on an Aboriginal reserve. So we just can't. we can't brush that away and say, let's fix something else, when that is, in some sense, a critical core problem. I mean, yes, the government does have, at some level, also an accountability, but it is designed for failure if they don't include, listen to, and allow some aspect of this to be Aboriginal-led, because that's what they're asking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your time on this day. Appreciate it. And a reminder to our audience that we did ask the government to provide a spokesperson to take part in our conversation today, but that invitation was not accepted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.